The house still smelled faintly of linseed oil and salt, the way it did when Elias came home with sawdust in his hair and a story tucked behind his smile. Nora had kept his desk closed like a sealed jar of air, certain that if she twisted the lid, the weather inside would spill out and drown her. Morning rain worrying the windows gave her cover to move slowly, to lift the hinge, to touch the scattered rulers and brass type as if they might bruise. The false bottom resisted, then clicked. An envelope lay there in a shallow cradle, cream paper pressed with the impression of their tiny letterpress bird. The handwriting turned her name into a shoreline. She read the first line once, twice, until the words cut clean. He had known. He had chosen silence. He had left a list of names, a map of the kindnesses he kept in the dark, and a single instruction in ink that would not fade. Start with Jonas. Grief had made routines into scaffolding. Nora washed the same mug, set the kettle to the same notch, stacked the same ledgers in the same measured tower, as if precision might keep chaos outside the door. Now the letter sat on the cutting mat like an animal that could bite, and the list of names hummed in her head. She tried to imagine a version of Elias who rehearsed goodbyes in another room, who weighed mercy against truth and chose the lighter load for her shoulders. And her stomach turned at the tenderness and the theft of it. The instruction glared from the page, a single verb disguised as a name. She pulled the key drawer open. The little brass tag that read, "Truck," winked. She didn't remember when the truck last started. She didn't remember who she would be if it did. The truck complained like an old man, then cleared its throat and agreed to live. Nora drove the hill down to town with the letter on the passenger seat beneath a book weight, resisting the urge to pin it with both hands. Rain stitched the harbor into quilts. Near the grocer, she saw Miriam through the window arranging tulips in a chipped enamel jug. The thought of stepping inside with what she knew felt indecent, like talking during a prayer. Miriam looked up anyway, that uncanny friend sense, and tapped the glass with a knuckle that said, "Come." Nora considered lying, which startled her. Grief had not made her a liar, but it had made her someone who hid. She opened the door, and the bell rang, and the smell of cardamom and newsprint smudged the sharp edges of the day. They sat in the storeroom among crates of mandarins and a bag of flour that had split its seam like a small snowdrift. Nora read the first paragraph aloud because her voice needed proof that she still owned it. Miriam listened with her hands around a thermos, eyes going gentle the way they did when customers told her about the worst days. When Nora reached the line about the choice to spare her the long decline, the room tilted, and she found the floor with her palm as if the earth might not be where she left it. Miriam did not reach for her, which was the mercy. Only said his love was clumsy sometimes but never counterfeit, and the two truths could sit side by side without burning the table. The bell at the front rang. The world kept happening. By late afternoon, the clouds thinned and let a cautious brightness through. Nora parked by the harbor where gulls argued over a paper bag, and she unfolded the list again to the name she had been circling like a wary cat. Jonas. The town kept his temper like a weather alert. She remembered his laughter too, how it could turn a kitchen bright, and how a silence had grown between the brothers like ivy over a door. She wrote his address on an index card because it felt less like fate that way, just an errand written neat. She sat with the engine ticking cool and promised herself she could turn the key and go home if the air in her chest got too tight. Then she put the card in her pocket and stepped onto the path that led uphill. The hill to Jonas' place rose in a slow curve that always felt steeper than it looked, the kind of climb that made the lungs tell the truth. Nora counted fence posts because numbers were easier than history. The garage came into view with its old tin sign and a row of broken chairs that never saw guests. Music thudded somewhere inside, a stubborn drum beat that pretended it couldn't hear the rain. She stood at the door long enough to feel foolish, then knocked again, then lifted her hand for a third time when the latch scraped and his face appeared in the shadow. She knew the years on him at a glance. the way the jaw set when bracing for impact. She held up the envelope like a passport and said his name as if it were a bridge. It felt more like the lip of a cliff. They spoke in a room full of metal that remembered every fight. The hydraulic lift held a car like a suspended sentence. Jonas didn't sit, which meant Nora didn't either, and their words met at chest height like weather fronts. She said the letter had named him first. He said of course it had, as if Elias had always known where the fire would start. When she told him about the diagnosis, Jonas laughed in the small, mean way of someone who has already cried and been poorly paid for it. He kicked at a crate and then apologized to the crate, which was its own confession. From a shelf he took a wooden box the size of a book, dovetails neat, lid carved with a tiny bird. He said Elias made it months ago, and left it with no instructions, except a name on a slip. He couldn't decide whether to burn it or return it. Today, he decided. At home, the rain thinned to a mist that turned the windows to vellum. Nora set the box on the desk where the envelope had first changed the air. The lid resisted, and then yielded with a small sigh that felt like a voice catching. Inside lay a folded photograph of the lighthouse on the headland, its paint weathered to the color of bone. The sky behind it, the cold blue of porcelain. Beneath it, a narrow slip with a stamped address and a name she didn't recognize, and a single line in Elias' hand that said simply, "Settle this." There was also a key, old and iron, teeth worn, heavy enough to make its own case. She smelled cedar and glue and something that might have been the shadow of his cologne. The room seemed to lean toward the objects as if they were a tide. She placed the photograph on the mat and felt the horizon move inside her. The address led to a 3-story building that wore its years without apology. Nora climbed stairs that smelled of lemon cleanser and old arguments. The door opened on a woman who had the set of someone who has learned to meet the world at full height. Nora introduced herself and the name in the letter, offered the photo and the key, as if they were flowers that might survive the hallway air. Lila listened without granting a verdict, then asked if Elias had sent her to tidy what he couldn't face. The question landed like a small stone against glass. Nora explained what she knew and what she did. Lila's mouth softened, then hardened. She said she didn't need debts settled by ghosts or messengers. She said some help arrives like a hand on the back of your neck. The door clicked in a way that made the stairwell louder than it had been before. She walked out into a sky that had the color of dishes left to dry. The harbor wind pushed at her coat as if urging her back to a life that no longer fit. She wanted to defend Elias and to prosecute him and to refuse both roles. At the corner, she found Miriam locking the shop, a string bag of groceries at her wrist, eyes searching Nora's face before the question formed. Nora told the story in a few clean lines, and felt how much of it refused to stay tidy. Miriam listened the way she stocked shelves, with order that made space for what was fragile. She said Lila's no might not be forever, and that sometimes the first answer is a test of whether you are willing to hear it. She asked what the next name on the list was. Nora read it aloud and found, to her surprise, that the word did not bruise her mouth. Tomorrow had shape again. The campus felt like weather that hadn't decided what to be yet, a mix of optimism and damp stone. Nora followed signs to a bursar's window, and then a hallway mural where names of donors bloomed in gilt. Elias's wasn't there, which was both like him and today a fresh splinter. A student waited on a bench with a backpack that could carry a life. When Nora said Mira's name, the young woman's shoulders drew up as if bracing for a collector. Inside a small office lined with second-hand plants, Nora offered the facts without ornaments. A scholarship paid each term, anonymous, now stalled by a death, and a letter. Mira listened like someone who had memorized the ways help arrives and what it asks in return. She said she didn't want charity to wear someone else's face. Nora said maybe it could wear her own for a while. The room held the word trust like a glass that might crack. Mira's refusal wasn't a slammed door so much as a hinge that needed oil. She agreed to coffee and to a look at the records Elias left. nothing more. After, Nora crossed town to the carpentry co-op where a saw whined and then quieted like breath after a run. The apprentice with Elias's old chisels introduced himself with a gentleness that seemed borrowed from another era. He said, Elias taught him to measure with his palms when rulers went missing and to sand toward the heart, which was both technique and sermon. A pegboard hung with tools included empty outlines shaped like absences. The boy, Owen, handed Nora a slip for lumber, paid in cash, and a note in Elias's script about a bench promised, but never delivered. Nora felt the arithmetic of kindness and cost tilt again. The list wasn't just about gifts. It was an inventory of debts that were also kinds of love. The address for the unpaid rent was a walk up above a bakery that breathed sugar into the stairwell. A woman opened the door with a dish towel over one shoulder and a face that had learned to keep the house together when the house didn't want to cooperate. She said Elias had left cash in an envelope under her mat the winter. Her hours were cut, that she never met him, that his kindness felt like a trick she didn't deserve. Nora said she didn't either most days. They stood by the window while the oven timer ticked and watched the street bend light around puddles. The woman, Marisol, showed Nora a print Elias had repaired for her husband's birthday, the edges mended so cleanly, the tear seemed like part of the design. Nora recognized the stitch. The bill on the table said 3 months due. She folded it into her pocket as if she'd always intended to. At the bank, the air smelled like pens that had never gone missing. A ledger clerk traced a column with a manicured nail and found a short-term loan in Elias' name that expired the week he died. The figure wasn't ruinous, but it carried the weight of the choices it financed. The clerk used words like delinquent and settlement while Nora watched her reflection in the glass between them, a woman who looked like she'd forgotten the language for asking. She signed and signed, the way you sign when you've been given a list you didn't ask for, and also can't ignore. Outside, the sky brightened, as if to insult her. She stood on the steps and counted how many times Elias must have climbed such stairs to barter months from a calendar he had already marked. She didn't cry because anger held the door, and anger sometimes does fine work. Night pressed its ear to the windows. Nora spread the artifacts like constellations on the desk. The lighthouse photograph, the iron key, Mira's flyer with the faint lighthouse icon, the slip about the bench, Marisol's clipped bill now empty of threat. She traced the small bird embossed on the corner of the scholarship envelope and remembered Elias testing that stamp for depth. The way he frowned when impressions ghosted. Patterns nudged her in the ribs until she looked. Birds and beacons, debts as bridges, gifts as lighthouses built in other people's rooms. If he had been mapping a way through, the headland must have been his true north. She copied each name in a clean hand onto new cards and set them in a row that curved like a shoreline. When she turned out the lamp, the room kept a quiet glow, as if paper could hold a little of what it had learned. The oncology wing had a silence that knew its own power. Windows framed a gray noon in a courtyard, trimmed to look like hope. Nora waited with the key heavy in her pocket and the letter in her bag, hearing the small metronome of her pulse knock against the seconds. Dr. Raza entered with the posture of a man who had carried too many endings in his coat. He listened, and when she offered the letter, he did not read it so much as honor it. He told her dates that blemished the calendar she kept in her head, months when Elias could still lift plywood, weeks when stairs became a mountain, days when breath was a thread. He said, Elias had insisted on privacy, had paid for it with appointments no one else attended. The timeline unfurled like a tide table, moon-pulled and merciless. Nora felt anger steady itself into something colder and more exacting. Comprehension. The road to the headland wound like a thought that didn't want to be spoken. Wind leaned on the truck, and the ocean rehearsed its single argument against the cliffs. The lighthouse rose from fog with the authority of things that have stood too long to explain themselves. Nora parked by a fence, gnawed by salt, and climbed the path where grass flattened and sprang back under her boots. Each step scuffed a memory she did not own. Childhood afternoons she had not been invited to. A vow made by a boy who didn't know the cost of such promises. The door at the base was painted the color of stubborn sky. The iron key fit the lock with a complaint, and then a relieved click. Inside, the air smelled of old rope and sun-baked paint. Stairs spiraled up, ribcage of a giant thing. She felt the letter shift against her ribs, like a restless bird. The keeper's room was a museum of useful ghosts. Lantern mantles in jars, ledgers with salt-bitten corners, a brass telescope that still wanted to be held. Ruth Ellery watched Nora with the calm of someone who had survived entire winters by counting waves. She had Elias eyes. Not in color, but in the way they paused before giving anything away. Nora said his name, and the room rearranged itself around the sound. Ruth told her about the day Elias came as a boy after his father was taken, how he stood pressed to the glass until the skin of his forehead fogged, how he asked what it took to make a light that could argue with dark. He promised then to control endings, a child's bravado that calcified into an adult's plan. Ruth motioned to a tin where letters had been kept safe, a second envelope marked for Nora only if she came. The room narrowed to that small square. She opened the second envelope in the lamplight. The handwriting was steadier than she deserved. Elias wrote of watching his father's boat vanish into weather shaped like a mouth, of learning that some endings choose slow and without pity. He wrote about the diagnosis, about the arithmetic of chemo against their mornings, about deciding to leave her the bright half because he could not bear to make her midwife to his decline. He did not argue that he was right. He asked to be forgiven for choosing the day and for asking Jonas to keep the fight away from their house. He asked her to finish the list, not as penance but as an apprenticeship in staying. Nora read until the words went translucent and then built back into shape. She felt something fracture and then redistribute, the way ice does when a weight shifts and the lake remains a lake. Night arrived clean, the kind that simplifies everything it doesn't swallow. Ruth climbed with Nora to the lantern, and they looked out where the black water wore a single white seam. The light revolved with its patient heart. Nora pressed her palm to the cold glass and tried to imagine the relief Elias had wanted for her, the way he had curated their life to spare her the long dimming. She admitted aloud to the drum of the beam that she would have held him through all of it, and that love had been ready for uglier rooms. Ruth nodded like someone who had witnessed both kinds of mercy. On the way down, Nora signed the log as visitors do, and then added a line that was not required. I will not curate. The wind found the stairwell and braided with her breath. Outside, the path back looked different, only because she felt taller inside her own bones. The house felt suddenly too small for what the letter had let loose. Nora pulled every card with every name and lined them on the floor until they curved like a broken shoreline. She said truths aloud to test their weight, that he had loved her, that he had hidden, that both could stand without canceling the other. The words did not steady the room. She fetched a chipped enamel tray, took the matches from the drawer where they lived, and set the first card in the center like a leaf that had forgotten the tree. The sulfur flared and trembled and went out before it convinced anything. She tried again, and the match had crumbled and smudged her fingertips with a yellow that looked like old bruises. The kettle clicked alive behind her, and that smallest kindness undid her. She sat on the floor among the names and let the exhaustion rise like a tide, and then pull back without taking her. Miriam came without knocking, which meant she had knocked in her mind and decided the door would forgive her. She found Nora sweeping the cards back into a stack with the ruthlessness of someone who cannot bear to see their own map. Miriam asked if the fire had helped. Nora said she had not managed that much and heard the bite in her voice only after it was out. Miriam took the sting like a professional, set down a cloth bag with soup and bread, and asked what the next name was. Nora said she was done with scavenger hunts and with ghosts who assigned homework. The silence that followed had shape and temperature. Miriam took a breath that said careful, then reminded her that grief was not a committee chair, and that refusing help is sometimes a luxury the living cannot afford. Nora asked her to leave, not because she meant it forever, but because the room had narrowed and she could not find the door. The phone rang in the kind of night when even the refrigerator hum sounded like a decision. Nora almost let it go quiet, then saw Mara's name and answered with a voice she did not recognize. Words tumbled fast, the scholarship stalled, her mother admitted for tests, a younger brother needing someone to keep him from missing school and from losing the thread. The cashier job could not stretch to cover both buses and groceries. Mira said she would pause the term and hope the bursar forgave the math later. Nora felt the match she had wanted to strike returned to her in a better form. She told Mira to hold, opened her ledger, and began a different kind of arithmetic. She had thread and paper and hands that knew how to turn scraps into something that looked like a future. She asked if Mira could meet her at dawn. She heard the word, yes, and understood it as a key. By morning, the bindery smelled like starch and optimism. Nora dragged tables to the windows, pinned a flyer in the cafe, and asked Owen to bring the bench frame that held more promise than wood. She wrote a sign with her neat hand, "Pay what you can," and stacked blank journals like loaves. Miriam arrived, despite the night before, and placed a jar labeled soup on the counter without asking permission. Lila came with a face that said she was not ready to forgive, but was willing to stand in the same room as forgiveness. Jonas shouldered through the door with a box of sandpaper and the look of a man who knows work is an apology that sometimes takes. The radio found a station that believed in trumpets. People drifted in on their lunch hour with wallets that felt like prayers and left with something made by hands that had been shaking yesterday and were not shaking now. The afternoon bloomed into a soft riot. Coins chimed in a ceramic bowl, and the square reader hiccuped and then behaved, and laughter found its way around the edges of the work like a balm that knew the route. Nora guided a child's small hands through a pamphlet stitch and felt the surety travel back into her own palms. Mira announced a number that covered buses and the bursar's threat with an inch to spare, and the room answered with a sound that made the ceiling feel taller. Jonas slid the completed slat into the bench, and the frame accepted it with a snugness that felt like a promise kept. Lila bought a journal and wrote her first line on the spot, then tore the page and handed it to Nora, a phone number under a sentence that read, "We can start over." At closing, Nora wrote receipts with a neatness that felt like breath. And when she looked up, the room was not just a room anymore. It was a raft. Morning came with a sky the color of clean paper. Nora ran a palm over the bench. Jonas finished and felt the joinery answer back with a quiet, yes. The list sat beside the ledger with fewer teeth now. She took the loan papers, the last overdue utilities, and the note about the small supplier who had fronted Elias Timber. The winter storms cut the roads. The bank's lobby smelled like citrus and copied time. She signed where ink told her to sign and slid the folder across, hearing the small thud of a door closing without slamming. Outside, she walked straight to the supplier's yard, a maze of planks leaning like congregants. The owner didn't ask for a story, only for the total, and when she paid, he gave her a box of offcuts as if to say, "This is how we pass grace along." Back home, she fed the scraps to the stove and warmed the bindery until the room stopped shivering. Ruth agreed to meet Jonas at the lighthouse with the caution of someone who knows wind can lift roofs. Nora drove them both in a silence that earned its place, the bench riding in the truck bed under a blanket. On the walk up, Jonas rehearsed apologies under his breath until they turned to steam. Ruth opened the door and stood with hands in her sweater pockets, like a harbor refusing to move and refusing to let go. Jonas said he was tired of breaking in the directions love pointed him to, that he had kept his fists up so long they thought they were his hands. Ruth said she had learned to forgive tides but not calendars, and then softer, that children make vows with blunt tools. Nora stayed against the wall where maps had once hung, and felt the room tilt toward repair. When Ruth finally said, "Come upstairs," the word landed like a ladder lowered to water. They carried the bench up the spiral, hands knocking the same rhythm into the rail. In the lantern room, Ruth ran her palm along the seat the way keepers test lenses for grit. She nodded once and said it would live here, where legs could rest between watch rounds, where school tours could sit while hearing about narrow escapes. Jonas looked smaller and then right-sized, like a photograph corrected for distortion. He thanked Ruth without garnish. Nora set a brass plaque she had lettered the night before into the recessed edge. For work done in weather. She remembered Elias's shoulders in the garage, the way his laugh made accidents back down, and felt grief simmer to something that could cook a meal. Ruth fetched mugs, a ritual that overwrites fragile beginnings with heat. They drank without toasts, the bean turning over them, and for a long minute no one felt the need to speak first. The hospice smelled of lemon and linen, a clean that made room for whatever the day brought. Nora signed the volunteer log with the same careful script she used for bindings. A nurse walked her past doors with paper, butterflies taped near the knobs, and a quiet television murmuring a game no one watched. Her first task was simple on paper and complicated in the body. Sit with a woman who woke in pain and in snatches of songs from a summer Nora hadn't been born into. She held a cool cloth. She read labels in a soft voice. She learned how to fold a blanket so it becomes a harbor and not a weight. At one point, the woman's eyes cleared, and she asked if Nora was family. Nora said not by any law, and was surprised by how relieved she felt, to be honest. When the woman slept, Nora wrote her name in the margin of the list and drew a small bird beside it. By week's end, the list had become a shoreline with only one cove left unnamed. Lila returned, scarf bright against the gray day, carrying a key ring that chimed like a verdict to reconsider. She said she had thought about ghosts and about messengers, and decided some deliveries arrive on time even when they come late. She placed the lighthouse photograph on Nora's desk and asked if the bench could host a reading for tenants who needed a room with light. Nora said yes before caution could draft paperwork. Together they outlined dates. Mira arrived with a flyer mock-up that sang louder than its paper voice. Jonas brought the toolbox he keeps for days. He wants to be useful. Miriam lined up cups as if they were a choir. When Nora slid the final card into the wooden box and closed the lid, the room did not go silent. It breathed. She wrote one more name beneath the last. Mine. Dawn walked out of the sea like a careful guest. Nora parked by the fence where Salt had chewed the paint to lace and took the path she knew now by breath, counting the spiral of the lighthouse steps without needing numbers. She carried no letters this time, only a notebook with blank pages and the key that had taught her the shape of doors. In the lantern room, she opened the notebook and did not write to Elias. She wrote to the small self that had survived the shock and the rearrangement, to the hands that had learned to sit with endings and also coax beginnings from paper and thread. She wrote that love had not broken when truth arrived, but had widened to make room. Wind shoved at the glass, and the light cut a steady circle across the water as if stitching a seam. She signed her name and felt it belonged to her whole. By mid-morning, the bindery smelled of lemon oil and bread from the bakery below. Nora flipped the sign to open and did not brace for grief at the door. The benches had been pushed against walls to make space for people and their reasons. A chalkboard announced the first lighthouse reading, and a workshop on mending torn spines that did not pretend books and people were different species. Miriam arrived with citrus slices floating in a jar as if sunlight could be poured, her eyes taking inventory of the room and of Nora's posture. Jonas carried in a bundle of cedar planks that would become shelves for books they had not yet imagined. Mira taped a flyer to the window and laughed at herself in the reflection for no reason other than being allowed to. The bell chimed and the town flowed in, not to fix Nora, but to be fixed alongside her. The first reading filled the room until the walls remembered They were elastic. Lila stood at the bench Jonas had smoothed and read a page that began as a complaint and ended as a promise to ask for what was needed without apology. The harbor wind thumped once at the window like a fist, turned lesson. Doctor! Raza, who had come at Nora's invitation and looked surprised to have accepted, spoke quietly about the kindness of informed consent, then folded himself into the back row, as if he belonged there by practice. Owen described sanding toward the heart, and how a board behaves when you listen. There were pauses that did not fear silence. There were laughs that did not explain themselves. Nora watched the room practice staying, the way people steady a ladder while someone climbs. She closed her eyes once and felt the beam of the lighthouse rotate inside her ribcage with unhurried certainty. Evening laid a long blue over the harbor, and the lighthouse sent its measured pulse. Nora climbed the headland path with the town moving below her like a living map. At the base, Ruth waited on the stoop with a thermos and 2 tin cups, a ceremony borrowed from keepers who understood rhythm as survival. They talked less than they listened. Ruth said she had seen storms that taught boats humility and calms that taught men to make bad bets. She said choosing the day had been a flawed mercy, and that flawed mercies were still mercies when held up to the right light. Nora admitted she had been angrier at the waiting than at the truth, and that the waiting was over. The beam passed and passed again, a heartbeat with patience. They carried the thermos to the lantern room and sat on the bench, marked for work done in weather. It fit. On a morning with a sky clear as a promise, Nora opened the bindery early and propped the door so the sea could eavesdrop. She laid out blank notebooks, a bowl of thread, a jar of pens, and a small sign that said, "Take one if you need it. Pay if you can." She pinned her letter to the wall where customers posted notices about kittens and apartments and concerts. The inked lines an invitation rather than a memorial. People came for glue or advice or a corner to sit in while they remembered something worth writing down. The bell kept time. At noon, she walked to the window and watched gulls edit the air. She thought of the boy at the glass and the man who chose a day, of the woman who had learned to stay, of the list that had reshaped itself into a circle. She turned the sign on the door to open for the rest of her life.